Hello, everyone, and welcome to BAM. I'm film programmer Jesse Trussell. We are so excited to be hosting this conversation tonight around the acclaimed new documentary MLK FBI. A huge thanks to IFC Films for making this possible. We are thrilled to be joined by the legendary filmmaker Sam Pollard, director of MLK FBI, who will be in conversation with the musician, author, and award-winning documentary filmmaker Questlove. If you are looking for captioning during this live stream of tonight's discussion, it will be accessible via the stream text link posted in the chat. Thank you to Jessica for making tonight's program more accessible. And now to kick things off, I'll turn it over to Questlove.
Thank you very much, Jessica. I have to say that this is one of my this is definitely a highlight for me as a film geek. I've been a fan of this gentleman for the longest, even his work as an editor and as a filmmaker. I mean, he's been involved with so many so many iconic films that I've grown up watching, from Style Wars, and especially his work with Spike Lee, Mo Better Blues, Jungle Fever, his work with Ernest Dickerson with Juice, even Four Little Girls documentary, even my very first film, Bamboozle, but more importantly, even as a director, Eyes on the Prize, Mr. Soul, which is also incredible to watch. But we're here today to discuss his powerful work in MLK FBI. Thank you for talking to us today, Mr. Pollard.
My pleasure, man. Thank you, man. Thank you.
I guess I want to say my first question is, for the longest, for all the talk that I've heard about J. Edgar Hoover's actions during the civil rights period, I always wondered, why doesn't someone expose and bring this to light? And how apropos that in this year alone, 3 very powerful films have come out with sort of Hoover's corruption at the center, which of course, in addition to the Billie Holiday movie and Jesus and the Black Messiah about the Black Panthers, is your film. What made you decide to do this film at this period?
Well, who knew that all of a sudden there'd be 3 films right out at the same time that looks at the FBI? I mean, I couldn't imagine it. But back in 2017, the producer of MLK FBI, Ben Hadeen, had read this book about Dr. King being surveilled by Hoover and the FBI, and he thought it was really a good read. He said he thought it would be a great film. So the writer of that book, a historian named David Gower, was someone I had known from Eyes on the Prize too. He'd been one of our consultants. So I read the book, and I also agree with Ben. I think this is a different way to look at King. It's a way to demythologize the FBI. Let's reach out to David. So we reached out to David, took an option on his book. Then we flew to Pittsburgh, where he lives, and we went over to his house with a camera crew in tow. And we sat down with him for 4 hours, Amir, and we talked to him about the genesis of the book, the material that he found uncovered in telling this story about how far the FBI would go to destroy and discredit Dr. King's reputation. And from that 4-hour interview that we did, we were able to create a sizzle reel and put together a treatment. And around 2018, went out and started to beat the bushes to try to raise the money. We went to Netflix, we went to Amazon, we went to others, and we got no feelers. Then in early 2019, these 2 organizations came along, one called Field of Vision, the other called Play Action, and they supported the film. They gave us the money to make this film, this independent doc, which enabled us to then interview Andy Young, one of Dr. King's closest associates, Clarence Jones, who was Dr. King's lawyer, and also a close confidant. And then we interviewed a former FBI agent named Chuck Knox, who was in Houston, Texas. And then Ben suggested we reach out to James Comey, the former director of the FBI. And
I was shocked at that.
Yeah, I was surprised he said yes, but he did. And then we brought in 2 historians, one who could really talk about the history of Hoover and the FBI, a woman named Beverly Gage, who teaches at Yale. Mm-hmm. And another historian, a woman named Donna Murch, who teaches at Rutgers, about COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program that the FBI started in the late 50s and early 60s to really infiltrate and destroy any organization they thought was left of center, be it Dr. King and the SCLC, or the Nation of Islam, or the Black Panther Party, or Angela Davis. Anyone they thought was going to destroy Hoover's notion of American democracy.
So just explain the process to me, which I'm not that familiar with. How long until confidential FBI files are available or made to the public?
The files were open now. I mean, they've been open for the last 4, 5, 6 years.
But then, I mean, from the time that it happens until.
Oh, it took a while. They were under lock and key for about 15, 20 years. And now they can be open. Transcripts you can read. Now the actual tapes that the FBI recorded, those have been sealed and they can be opened in 2027. So anything.
Oh, so we still have yet to hear.
You haven't heard the actual tapes yet.
I was wondering, especially about one of those tapes that was mentioned in the movie. Assuming that our audience was paying attention. Yeah. Right. If so, that actual tape is in existence, the kill yourself, whoever.
Well, that wasn't a tape so much. That was a letter.
That was a letter. Okay.
That was a letter that was created by William Sullivan, basically, supposedly an African American telling Dr. King, "We know how bad you are. We know, all the stuff that you're doing. You should, intimate that he should kill himself."
But what about the tape of the one that was sent to Coretta Scott King?
They took a piece of that tape and they sent it. They put together a tape, supposedly of Dr. King in a compromising situation with another woman, and They sent that to Coretta Scott King. Now, the King family might have that tape, but we never reached out to the King.
Okay, that's what I was wondering about. Yeah. Okay, when you're working on a project like this, are you at all curious about, or how do you handle? First of all, was there anything revealed to you that you didn't know previously?
Well, before, I didn't really know the details of how far the FBI would go to discredit King until I got the transcripts and read through those transcripts. I didn't know they had gone that far. I knew about the wiretapping, but I knew that King had always had extramarital affairs, but I didn't know how far the FBI would go to use those against him. That I didn't know until until I read that book by Garrow, So that was sort of like, wow, they went beyond the pale to destroy King. I mean, That wasn't legal at all.
I'm actually, based on what I've witnessed in recent times, and even in like Hollywood's version of scandalous exposés, especially in the light of like scandal culture and tabloid fodder and whatnot. During this period between 66 and 68, when the heat is on, how far did it ripple into, again, I know that there really wasn't a thing as tabloid culture in the late 60s, but how did this make the rounds in like mainstream news at all, or?
No, it never got any traction. Now, I would assume that the mainstream media was aware of it because the information was being leaked from the FBI to the mainstream media. But the thing to remember is that in the 60s, the mainstream media, unlike the mainstream media today, didn't grab onto the personal lives of people and expose those things. I mean, they had all known about JFK's extramarital affairs. They knew about the dirty secrets in RFK's life and in Lyndon Johnson's life. And they knew about about Dr. King's other relationships. But back then, that was sort of like their hands-off attitude, that they didn't go that far. I mean, as you know, we all know the world has changed a lot today. Everything is open game now. But back then they didn't do it. And that's what upset Hoover. They couldn't get any traction from any of the public media.
As I was watching this, I was kind of wondering if you ever had any desire to just do an entire project dedicated to Hoover, because even millennials that I talk to now, they're the last year and a half has been sort of not even a reckoning, but a real eye opening about the country that we live in. And I know that for a select few that have the privilege to kind of put blinders on, there's definitely a sect of Americans who, see the law as, like officer friendly and how you doing, sir? And that that sort of thing. Only to sort of realize, I mean, it's been the heat's turned up, since 2014. I mean, for me, forever. I mean, you could say 91 with Rodney King and even before that. But for at least with millennials and Gen Z, there's just I've been sort of looking at comments and whatnot and seeing that there's just a level of shock. And, a lot of them are asking like, well, how could you guys let this happen? And, I try to explain to them that there were a lot of repercussions 50 years ago for even standing up and speaking out. Assassination was real. Whereas now we're more bold and more brazen than ever to call it out without that level of
retaliation.
Of retaliation. So, I mean, do you think that it's warranted that there is kind of a thorough study of the history of Hoover alone, just with his tenure with the FBI and the effects that it's had on, because I almost feel like that's probably the most dangerous element of the last 50, 60 years almost.
I would say this. I would say that a filmmaker or filmmakers could tackle doing a full portrait of not only Hoover, but the FBI's history in a much more complicated way than we've seen in other documentaries or other films, fiction films, to really do a deep dive. The challenge with Hoover, though, is that there's lots of rumors about Hoover's personal life, but there's nothing ever been, unless someone sends me a book or books that can speak specifically where they find some real concrete information about his personal life. I think you can do the deep dive into his tenureship as the director of the FBI and looking at the complexity of the FBI under his tenureship, which I think would be a fascinating film.
So all those rumors about Hoover is just strictly hearsay. None of it was ever on the record, or?
Yeah, there's always these rumors about supposed cross-dressing, about his 40-year relationship with Clyde Tolson, but there's nothing ever factual. I mean, if someone brings up real factual stuff, then we could dig into it.
I mean, it goes to show you how. Now, see, I grew up thinking that was factual and on the record, and I did not know that. Okay, I see.
Yeah. Think about it this way: the FBI was a very strategic organization under Hoover's helmsmanship to be able to create this myth of themselves, as you saw in the film, where they were the good guys. They were fighting gangsters like John Dillinger. They were trying to discourage communism in this country. They were really, planting these seeds by going through Hollywood and movies like that to paint them as this very sort of upstanding, upright organization.
Do you think now, because even I almost feel like there's a parallel karma thing happening. 50 years ago, of course, the FBI for African Americans, for anyone that disagreed with their position, period, was very untrustworthy. And pretty much, made no bones about the levels of which they could set you up or get rid of you if they wanted to. In addition to that, with the distrust of that African Americans have had with the medical community, now we're in 2021, in which it's kind of like we need the FBI more than ever to right wrongs as far as what happened on like January 6th, and in addition, the controversy with how most African Americans feel, at least with the skepticism of where we are with the medical world as far as science and the vaccine and whatnot. Where do you think the FBI stands now in terms of, have you made parallels of where they stand now as opposed to 50 years ago?
Well, here's my take on the FBI today. I mean, they're still an organization who, what is their job? Their job is to combat anyone or any group that they think is going to undermine the notion of American democracy. Now, they have been very, very proactive in doing that with any groups on the left. The question we have to ask ourselves is, how proactive have they been in dealing with groups on the right, white supremacist groups? You know, the other question we should ask ourselves is that this organization that is very technologically savvy in 2020 and 2021, how come they were not prepared for what happened on January 6th? You know, with all the monitoring and information gathering that they have at their hands, their fingertips, how come they weren't prepared? So you have to question the agenda of the FBI constantly. Never take for granted that, you know, that they have found the right way in terms of how they deal with people who they feel is left of center. You know, I'm of the mindset that the kind of infiltration and what they did in the 60s by infiltrating organizations like the SCLC, like the Black Panther Party, like even, you know, Fred Hampton's Black Panther Party in Chicago with William O'Neill, they are probably still actively doing that today in organizations like Black Lives Matter. So I don't think, you know, as much as I would like to say, you know, they've turned the corner, I don't believe it.
I see. Oh, note I said, as much as we need them, more or less need them for, you know, administering true justice. Now, their willingness to administer it, that's another
question.
That's another question.
Yeah.
So as a first-time film director, I have a question for you.
Sure.
When dealing with a documentary, I know there's two ways to, you know, there's two types of documentaries at the very beginning. One is when you have an overabundance of information. It's like how much to leave out and how much to edit. And then there's some documentaries in which you have very little information and you have to figure out clever ways to fill that out and make it interesting. Going into this movie, what side of the fence were you on as far as making this documentary? Was it a lot of information, some that you had to leave out of the film, or was it just enough to sort of get to the almost 90-minute, 2-hour mark?
We had an abundance of material. I mean, we knew that there was a rich archive that covered both Dr. King's ascendancy from Montgomery, Alabama, up until his assassination. We also knew there was a rich archive of material that looked at the development of the FBI and building up the mythology of the FBI, from that footage of Herbert Hoover with these young boys to him out on the firing range. And we also had these old movie clips that touted how wonderful the FBI was, from I Was a Communist for the FBI to Big Jim McClain to the FBI story of Jimmy Stewart. So we knew we had a lot of material. The challenge that we faced when we did our first cut was like 2.5 hours. Okay. Because we covered every aspect of Dr. King's trajectory, you know, and then we knew that we had to pull back on that and really bring it down to a manageable size, where we were going to keep those tensions between Hoover, you know, obsession with destroying King and King's ascendancy, and understanding he was also being constantly monitored and watched. So we lost some stuff. We had a section about these two brothers, Morris and Jack Childs, who were communists in the 30s, had been disenchanted with the Communist Party in the 40s, but then came back and rejoined the Communist Party at the behest of the FBI and became informants for the FBI in the 50s. And one of their longtime associates and had been a friend was Stanley Levinson, who had became one of Dr. King's closest advisors. And
Mhm.
that was the initial reason that Hoover and the FBI started to wiretap Dr. King, because of his relationship with Stanley Levinson, who had been a former communist, and Hoover knew about his relationship with those Childs brothers, because the Childs brothers were always speaking directly to the FBI when they were getting information about the Communist Party in the USA.
Okay. I think we're going to take some questions from our audience. Our very first question comes from Lindsay, and she wants to know. Actually, I found this your very first shot. I found very impressive. Because I'm familiar with the show The FBI. She wants to know, can you talk about why you decided to include footage in your movie from old Hollywood movies set in the FBI?
Because I've wanted people to understand that this mythology that is built around the FBI was perpetuated by media, by movies, by Hollywood movies. I mean, that's why one of the first things I said to the editor, Laura Tomaselli, who did a fabulous job, was, here's a list of movies that you should get clips from that can help move this story along. I mean, John Wayne, American Icon, Jimmy Stewart, that series that was on ABC, the FBI, FNZ.
The FBI, yeah.
Yeah. So I just wanted to make sure people understood that this perpetuation of the mythology of the FBI had something that had really, been pushed by Hollywood, and to see that and see how we were going to use that to sort of unfold this story.
I'm going to add on top of that, because I also wanted to know, and again, I'm asking as a first time filmmaker. This is a question that only filmmakers would ask other filmmakers. Was there any problems as far as clearance and using file footage or I see it almost as sampling, like with hip hoppers.
Yeah, in some cases, some of the footage you got to pay the rights for.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes, if you try to use this term we use in documentaries called fair use, where you're trying to basically get it without paying, you sometimes have to use only a certain amount of footage in a sequence. You can't use, like, let's say there was 2 minutes of footage from the film Big Jim McLean. We couldn't use 2 minutes and make a fair use case. We could only maybe use 40 seconds, so we'd have to cut it down. In some cases, we had to pay for the footage because they weren't going to accept fair use. Some of these archives, like NBC or ABC or Getty, we had to pay for the footage, So you're always budgeting for how much you think the footage will cost. And then you always, if you're doing a documentary, you hire a fair use lawyer, because if there's some footage you want to try to get for free because of that fair use doctrine, you have a lawyer evaluate it when you have a rough cut.
So for those that are watching right now that don't understand, I believe fair use is, I guess there's a law that a filmmaker can use or shield that a filmmaker can use, that if it's for educational purposes, then it's
applicable. Game. Yeah, it's fair game. But you got to really make a good case for it. You got to make sure you use it in the film in that way.
Okay.
So it can work under that rubric.
So as long as under the guise of educating.
Yeah.
Or adding to the subject that you're talking about at the moment, then
exactly. That's why you have a lawyer go through it and watch and analyze everything in the film where you're saying you want fair use.
Okay. We have Gene, and Gene is asking, what's the most surprising information you discovered while making this documentary?
The most surprising information for me, quite honestly, was the trajectory of Lyndon Johnson's sort of connection to King and the Civil Rights Movement. If you listen to the audio, his first piece of audio, he's very friendly with Dr. King and talking about, if you want to call me, collect, I'll pick up the call. You should use my speech. They're on really friendly terms. The second piece of audio is when King was about to come back from Sweden after he won the Nobel Peace Prize. And this person on the phone is saying to Dr. Johnson, President Johnson, Lyndon Johnson, how do we want to deal with Dr. King? Do we want to set up a meeting with you and him? And by this time, they knew about his extramarital affairs. So Johnson is reluctant to really sort of have a meeting with King. And then the third piece of audio, which is even more fascinating, is Johnson talking to Hoover about how to watch and monitor Dr. King, because he's a dangerous guy. So that to me was kind of an interesting trajectory in terms of how Johnson responded to King as things changed in King's world when King finally came out on April 4th, 1967 at the Riverside Church against Vietnam.
Right. Of course. That's when tables really turned.
That's right.
So for Martha, her question is, and this is another thing I admired, the boldness of not having talking heads. Martha wants to know, why did you decide to have voiceover talking heads instead of us seeing who was speaking?
Well, in 2011, I had seen a documentary called The Black Power Mixtape. Remember that film?
I believe I'm in it.
Oh,
yes.
You are? Yeah.
No. I scored it. I'm sorry.
You scored it. That's right.
I wake up on a Tuesday. Yeah, I scored this film. Yeah, I scored that film.
Yeah, you scored it. So I had seen that film, and I was so impressed with the boldness of the director having people off camera like Sonia Sanchez and Belafonte,
Mm-hmm.
And Angela Davis, talking about that phenomenal period in our history from 67 to 75. And I remember saying, man, if I ever get the chance to do a film, I'm going to do it just like that. So before we started to shoot a frame, we even do the interview with David Garrow, I said to Ben Hadeen, my producer, man, I want to do it just like this filmmaker in Sweden did, Goran. I want to have nobody on camera. I want people to get engaged in the footage, and that was a strategy from the beginning. And we only shot the people on camera because we initially got some pushback that, maybe that's not going to work. Maybe just in case it doesn't work, you should see them on camera,
Right.
That's why we did it. And it worked out because then in the epilogue, Laura came up with the idea, the editor, she came up with the idea to put them on camera, which I thought was like, great. It was just too bad we didn't have Comey on camera because he was the only one who did an audio interview.
Okay, I see. Yeah, no, I love that technique. Also, I think in the Bruce Lee 30 for 30 film, they kind of use the same technique.
Yeah, they do it.
Where they waited for the very end to reveal people.
Yeah, that's right.
And let me add on top of that. As a person that's been making films for 40 plus years, is there a documentary technique that has yet to be or a challenge? And I'm saying challenge in terms of like European filmmakers have like Dogma 95.
Yeah, sure.
Like, is there a technique or challenge in documentary land that has
not been done,
yet to be done, or is challenging to do, that you wonder, like, I wonder if I could pull that off?
Here's what I would say. Every technique has probably been done. The thing is sometimes when it hasn't been done in a long time and you do it again, it's fresh. Like for everybody now, the fact that I had no talking heads is like a fresh idea. But quite honestly, man, I had done that after I saw Black Power Mixtape when I did the Sinatra doc for Alex Gibney that he directed. We had nobody on camera. Everybody was voiceover on the Sinatra doc. I mean, right. Even in the Amy doc that you were, there's nobody on camera unless they were in old archival footage.
Right, right.
So it's a technique that's been done before. It's just that it just feels fresher with this particular story. And there's always, the thing that's always interesting about filmmaking, and like music, you come up with a new approach and you say, oh, I think this is fresh. And then all of a sudden you realize that somebody did it 10, 12 years before.
That's literally the story of every rapper. They think they
that's right.
invented the wheel. Josh has a question, and his question is, do you think that there's a chance that Coretta Scott King and MLK might have had an open relationship, or is that unfounded or implausible historically?
Whoa, that's a good question. I haven't had that.
Yeah, I was like, oh, okay.
Well, I would make this assumption that she was aware I just rewatched Selma. I just rewatched the film Selma.
Right.
And it's clear that she's aware that he's had relationships. I think the thing that troubled her, so in that particular film, was that it was being put right at her doorstep with that tape. You know, so I don't know if I would use the term open relationship. I would use the term that she was aware that of his wandering eye. I'll use that term.
Closer to don't ask, don't
tell.
smell. Yeah, exactly. Gene wants to know, what do you hope that people will go away thinking or feeling after watching this documentary?
Well, I want an audience to realize that Dr. King, as wonderful, as iconic, and as important he is to not only American history, but world history, but he was a human being. He had his own flaws. He had his own challenges. But I also want people to walk away understanding that the FBI really was a really, deceitful, undercover, secret police force whose job was to destroy people who they thought was in their particular mindset going to destroy the notion of American democracy. And you should be wary of the FBI even today.
I see. Actually, I grew up in a family of conspiracy theorists. I think everyone has a conspiracy theory uncle in their family. I actually wanted to know, did you find any evidence whatsoever? Because I'm still not totally convinced that the Johnson era FBI didn't have their hand in
assassination.
King's assassination. Were you actively looking to see if there was any evidence that led to that, or?
No, we weren't. But I think that's as I always say, that's for that could be either me or another filmmaker to do a film that would dig into that. Because you saw the question I asked Andy Young. I mean, how was it possible with the heavy surveillance over on Dr. King and his associates that the FBI was not aware that there was someone else out there who was looking to assassinate Dr. King? It just doesn't make sense. Either they were that incompetent, or they turned a blind eye to it, the FBI.
Let's see. We have a question from Jeffrey. He says, historical documentaries are so different than fly on the wall ones.
Yeah.
Was there ever a script for MLK FBI? And do you feel more comfortable having more control over the material?
There was no script. There was no script for it. I mean, it was basically quite understandable that it was going to be what I call, a chronological narrative, in a sense, where you really were unfolding the ascendancy of King from 1955 up until his assassination, at the same time as we were sort of digging into demythologizing the FBI. For me as a documentary filmmaker for all these years, I love the challenge of working with fly on the wall footage, verite footage, as much as I like working with historical footage, because what my goal is always is to put together a film that's not only in some ways as historically accurate as I can be, but also to make them filmically engaging, and pace-wise interesting enough that I keep the audience pulled into the material. That's my job. And either one, I don't feel it's easier for me to do a historical doc as the one that's a fly on the wall doc. They both have their challenges.
Was there any temptation whatsoever to, again, we sort of have this very angelic view of Dr. King. Mm-hmm. Now, I will say that this film probably had and this might be weird to say, this film kind of had the opposite effect, where I felt that humanized him more, mm-hmm. Which I don't want to say humanize it like in an Us Weekly, like, oh, celebrities are just like us, like we cheat on our wives. But I almost felt like this is probably the most information I've got from the human side of Martin Luther King.
Well, that was the idea, to humanize him, to not, you know, make him this deity that a lot of people have sort of anointed him.
Right. That's all we knew. This
Yeah.
sort of holy figure that we had,
Yeah.
our savior. That, you know, I didn't know if he had a sandwich. In my movie, Jesse Jackson revealed probably the most shocking thing. I was unaware that Andrew Young, Ralph Abernathy, Martin Luther King, and Jesse Jackson were having a pillow fight 5-10 minutes before he got assassinated.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
they were making fun of like Jesse not having a tie for dinner, and he threw a pillow, and then they had a pillow, and then they were just like, you know, Jesse says, we were just clowning around, letting off steam, having a pillow fight. And then of course Benjamin Branch comes, and Martin goes out there to greet him and say hello, and then that's when it happens.
That's it. Yeah.
But even when he was telling that story, I mean, I was taken aback simply because that was probably the first time that I heard him doing something common or human.
Yeah.
You know,
He
like,
was
he was having a
being.
pillow fight. He knows how to pillow fight, you know, that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, that's the point. I mean, you know, these are our heroes, but that don't mean we're going to put them up on pedestals. That's what you have to be careful of all the time. You don't put your heroes up on pedestals. You know, it's like I would say to somebody, to veer off Dr. King, you know, I grew up loving, you know, two musicians, Max and Charles Mingus, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, they're great musicians, but as I dig into their personal lives, they were much more complicated. You know,
Yep.
which doesn't take away from their musicianship, but just makes them human. It's the same thing with Dr. King.
Is there a fear of discovering the unknown, and is there a moral obligation to let it all out? Because even with the rumors that they were starting, my first thought was, yo, what if that was actually true? Like,
Well, that's the question.
would you leave it in? Would you not leave it in? You know.
Well, you know, I'll speak specifically to the rape allegations. That
Yeah.
were made in the
Okay.
film. You know, we talked about that. Me and Ben had that same conversation. Should we put it in? Should we leave it out? You know, we knew that if we left it out, someone would say, "Oh, you guys want to do a sanitized thing on Dr. King. You didn't want to deal with some of those intense allegations that had been brought up by David Garrow in 2017." So we knew that we had to face it and deal with it in the film. But then we understood that from an editorial perspective, anytime you get these elements of a film that feels a little dicey, you have to figure out editorially how to present them in a way that doesn't feel like a gotcha moment, you know, or tabloid moment. So we had to do two or three versions of this editorially to make it feel the way we made it feel in the film. You know, that's why it was important. Anytime we sat down with the historians and we did our homework, we wanted to speak to asking them the question about that rape allegation and the information that was on that transcript that the FBI wrote in the margin. And they said we watched Dr. King watch this woman being raped. Well, how could they have watched it if they were listening? You know, so you have to question the FBI. You know, so you know, I just feel as a filmmaker, I'm trying not to skirt issues. I'm trying to face them head on. I'm trying to present them in a way that people can have their own opinions about it.
I see.
Yeah.
We have a question from Jean. She wants to know, what will your next documentary be about?
I got one finishing up about Arthur Ashe, and there was another one, the icon of the '60s. At the same time as people like Ali and Tommy Smith and John Carlos were, you know, basically being much more proactive than Arthur Ashe and what that meant to him, how complex that was. And you and I are trying to get this doc off about the Negro Leagues.
I was going to say, I was going to disclose to the people that it's kind of weird. This entire year, besides one actual face-to-face meeting, Sam and I have probably had more FaceTime on Zoom in this office, you know, in our respective settings, because we are trying to sort of kickstart probably the most definitive documentary about the Negro Leagues.
Right.
And God willing, it will
That
come
will
out.
happen. Yeah.
Yeah, come out in due time. I do have, I kind of have a question about another pivotal 60s figure. This is kind of a yes or no, so I'll let you off the hook with just a yes or no.
What was that?
In terms of telling the story of a beloved yet flawed figure. My fear of the discovery of the result of this film could have gone either way. However, I wanted to know, do you think that in this, not in this lifetime, I'm sure that there will be in this lifetime, but at least in the next 5 years or so, do you think that there could ever be a documentary about the life of Cosby? Too soon?
No. I think it could be. The challenge will be, is how to approach it. How to deal with it.
Would you ever be up to the task if that were open, or, is that too much to handle?
Hey, I'm up to the task.
Oh, okay.
I'm up to it. Yeah.
All right. So you never met a challenge that you couldn't.
It would be a richly complicated film, and talk about causing some controversy. That film would cause controversy from all perspectives, man.
I see.
Wow.
So we have a question here from Lauren. She says that the film was really shocking in how it presented Dr. King being received negatively in his own time. And we don't see that often. Can you talk about why you wanted to highlight that?
Well, I don't think I was trying to highlight it. I was just trying to show that Dr. King was a human being who had his own sort of flaws.
Mhm.
As we were saying earlier, no human being walks on water. We all have our flaws. And some people have said, well, do you always feel like you have to show people's flaws? Well, when I'm doing a documentary about somebody, I don't want it to be a puff piece. I don't want it to be hagiography. I'm looking to really grapple with certain things. I'm not gonna paint them as a horrible person. I'm just gonna try to paint them as a complex person, if that's what they were all about.
Well, I'm assuming she was asking about that level of flaw, but I actually, in my mind, I know that just from the research that I've done, that the second that he started speaking out against the Vietnam War,
It was persona non grata.
that was the proverbial nail in the coffin.
Yeah.
That was the line that was drawn.
Yeah.
And I think many people don't know that he was damn near abandoned by both sides, by
That's right.
liberals, moderates, those on the right, those on, like, pretty much that was, too controversial at the time. And I don't think people know that. Again, like we have this sort of glossy view of what Dr. King represented, and not many people know that the last year of his life was sort of, his approval rating, if there was one, would have been super low from society at the time. I don't think people knew that.
Well, there's this documentary called King in the Wilderness, and that's really speaking to that period in his life.
Really?
It was done a few years ago. I mean,
Okay.
listen, he's severed his ties with the Johnson administration. There are those in the civil rights movement feels that he's left his lane. He's trying to figure out what the next step should be after all that happened in the early 60s. That's why he comes with the Poor People's Campaign. Then he's asked to go to Memphis to help with the sanitation workers strike. Reluctantly, but he goes, and then basically the end.
Yeah.
So he had a lot on his plate. He always had a lot on his plate, but he was still fighting a good fight.
I think I asked this question earlier, but Ginger has a different angle to it. She wanted to know, is there any documentary footage that you discovered during this period of production that was surprising to you or made you think about the narrative of the civil rights movement differently?
Um, I did talk about some of the footage. The only thing that I think was interesting was these phone calls that Johnson had first with King, then with one of his close associates when King had gotten the Nobel Prize, and they was asking him if should he meet with Dr. King, and then Johnson's conversation with Hoover, where you see that he's completely turned on Dr. King. I think I think that if somehow Hoover and King had stayed connected, it would have probably been helpful for the civil rights movement. But when King came out against Vietnam, that destroyed it.
You're right. You're right. We're going to take a few more questions before we wrap up.
Okay.
Matt says it's shocking to him how it seems how white people saw King back then and how relevant this is today with what is happening with the targeting of Black leaders. Do you think that the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement are being targeted right now?
Yeah, I do. I think the big difference is there's not one person, it's there's many different people are being targeted. I think one of the things that's
Pretty much
interesting,
Black people.
yeah, but I think what's interesting about this movement, unlike Dr. King, we've changed in terms of having focusing on one leader now. There's multiple leaders. And even then, we should remember that even during the civil rights struggle, as you just mentioned, there were other people who were in that orbit who were doing extraordinary things, like Jesse, like Ralph Abernathy, like James Bevel, like Andy Young. The movement would not have happened if King didn't have others supporting him, and if those who had come before him hadn't been out there, Rosa Parks, all these people.
I have another question. How many talking heads did you initially want for this film,
Not
as
many.
opposed to what you received?
This is one of the few films where my sort of a calculated aesthetic, ideas held. And again, right from the beginning, I said no talking heads. Then I said to Ben, when we were talking about how many people we should interview, I said it should be a small group. Because normally when I'm doing these docs, man, I interview between 15 and 20 people. Sometimes as much as 25. And then when you're in the editing process, you either get down to like 10 or 12. This one, I knew that we wanted 2 close confidants of King. We wanted 2 historians besides Garrow, that makes 5. And we wanted 2 FBI agents, and we got lucky with getting Comey. So there was only 7 people. One other person that we interviewed who comes in near the end of the film. There's only 8 people in the whole film, And I think the success of it is because they weren't on camera.
How long was the Comey interview?
It's only about 20 minutes. That's all it was. Yeah.
So there's never fear that with so many with so few talking heads and interviews that are only 20 minutes, there's never a fear that you might have more, metaphorically speaking, like more broth than actual substance for the soup?
It depends on, this one was a gamble. This one we thought we had enough voices to tell a story as voiceover. Now, if I had been doing it on camera, I might have said, well, let me play it safer and get more people to give me some much more different perspectives, because you want to see them on camera. So, I don't even know how I'm going to do, the Ash film that I did now, it's got people on camera, but the one that we're talking about, Negro Leagues, that's going to be a lot of voiceover, because some of these players who didn't live, who aren't alive anymore, they have talks and they've done diaries and journals that we'll use. And our main character, Bob Marley, is going to be a voiceover character. So it always depends on the film and the material that you have at hand and how you think you want to approach it from an aesthetic perspective.
Okay. Gene wants to know, have you received any reactions about this documentary from the King family?
Yeah. The lawyers reached out because they want to get paid. Well, I shouldn't say that. the lawyer, this is live, right? The lawyers have reached out, after the film sort of got picked up by IFC. So now it's between our lawyers and their lawyers, and I basically am out of that loop.
Wait, so there's still negotiations happening way after the film comes out?
Well, it's about the use of his image and his audio, you know, because Dr. King's image and audio for the King family is worth a lot of money, you know.
Oh, so one can't make that fair use, or
You can. That's what we did. But
okay.
it would be like if you were, Frank Sinatra and your family wants to use your songs. I mean, some filmmaker wants to use your songs, and they say, "Well, you can't use that song because my dad sang that song because he was Frank Sinatra." That's how it works. You know that. Yeah.
I just come from a time period where Dr. King's image was so ubiquitous. I just thought it was.
Yeah, you could just use.
Hey, let's lose this footage right here, and I didn't realize now that it might be cha-ching time.
Archival footage is worth its weight in gold now, man. As you know, it's worth its weight in gold. People pay a lot of money now to use archival footage.
I see now. I see.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have Morgan. He asks, has your perspective on the film changed from when you initially made it versus finished it, versus with everything that's happened in the current events from the shootings and Black Lives Matter protests in January 6th?
I would say my perspective has changed because from the point of view that I hadn't realized how strongly the film would resonate in 2020 and 2021. I knew it would have some impact because it does reflect America, but the tremendous amount of impact it has had, it's really surprised me. Really has surprised me.
I see. All right. Well, I have one last question before we wrap up. Again, with where you are now, what do you prefer? Do you prefer editing, having someone else in charge and you editing, or sort of helming your own documentaries and telling your own stories? Because I know that's a lot of responsibility.
Well, I love the second, man. I love helming the film, telling my own stories. And, I don't really edit anymore. I haven't really edited anything in about 4 or 5 years. I'm just directing now, and I enjoy it. But listen, editing, directing, shooting, it's all part of the process of making a good film. And if you got all those elements and you collaborate with the right people, sometimes you grab the brass ring and sometimes you don't.
I see. Well, wait, as far as editing is concerned, I'm kind of, having never directed a feature film, non-documentary, I always thought the law or the rule was that once the director, and I'm going on sort of Martin's relationship with Martin Scorsese and Thelma Schoonmaker.
Sure. Yeah.
I always thought the law was once the film is finished,
mm-hmm.
all the footage goes to the editor and the micromanaging stops there. Like you just have to trust that the editor will do their job. So you've been in situations where they micromanage and right on your shoulder and this is what I want.
I mean, sure. Any good director, listen, there's all kinds of directors of these films. There's some directors who can micromanage and not be in the room. They could be 100 miles away, but they can still be micromanaging. Saying, I don't like this shot, when you put this cut in, just change this. There's some directors who want to sit right over your shoulder and tell you where to make the cut physically, which I never liked, So a good film director, from my perspective, understands that when they find an editor, they want to find an editor who they trust will be able to execute their vision. Now, what that means different things to many directors. For me, it means that I'm able to liberally give the editor the opportunity to have the framework of my ideas, but then to build on that and make something even a little more different than what I thought and make it better. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So I've always been a director who feels very confident when I get the right editor, they can find my vision by using their own imagination, Now, if I was one of those directors, since I was an editor, wanted to say, well, I have to sit there and cut it myself because I'm such a good editor and I can find it, then I should cut my own films. But I never felt like that. And I still don't, I trust the people I hire. If I don't trust them, then I shouldn't have hired them.
So you would never direct and edit your own?
No.
You don't trust that?
No. That's a lot of
it's
work.
not a Prince thing. Like see, musicians do that. They songwrite, they produce, they also mix and edit their own
Well,
stuff. So
some director editors do that too, but I'm not one of them.
okay, good to know that. You know,
Yeah, I
just
don't
trying to
need
get my
do that.
education on. Well, Sam, I thank you very much. And on behalf of the BAM audience watching, we thank you guys for watching. Well, assuming that they're clapping their hands right now. Thank you for talking to us, Sam.
It's been a pleasure,
Appreciate it.
man. Thanks,
And
man.
the guys from BAM, thank you very much. And I'm Questlove, and we hope you enjoyed MLK FBI. Thank you.
Cool.